I think we're going to try to get started. So if there's anybody outside, appreciate it if we can have them come in so we can get going.
Big break, so to speak.
Well, good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. For those of you who haven't been here, this is the living memorial to our 28th president. So you're actually in a memorial. My name is Dave Rajewski, and I direct the Science and Technology Innovation Program here and also the Synthetic Biology Project. I thought I'd just start with a quick observation. Some of you probably were in this room maybe 2003, 2004, when we started to have bilateral and multilateral discussions around nanotech. And most of those were driven largely by research. So by 2005, over 20 countries, the US, EU, had actual nanotechnology sort of national initiatives. And a lot of the people who ran those initiatives would get together formally and informally to have discussions. So the entry point into nanotech was largely driven through research and science. I think the interesting thing with synthetic biology is the entry point might be through ethics and through the two reports that you're going to hear about today. And if that's the case, it has some pretty significant implications about how the discussion might evolve and who the institutional actors might be and the nature of the discussion. So I think this may be the first time that we've done a side-by-side analysis of these two reports. So let me just introduce the panel very briefly. You've got full bios in the package. Down at the very end is Dr. Anita Allen, who's the Henry Silverman Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She also serves as the Deputy Dean for Academic Affairs of the school and is a Senior Fellow in the Bioethics Department at the School of Medicine. Next is Dr. Christine Grady. She's currently the Acting Chief of the Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health. She's also a Senior Research Fellow at the Kennedy Institute for Ethics and was elected as a Fellow at both the American Academy of Nursing at the Hastings Center. Next, representing the European Group on Ethics, we have Dr. Hilla Hacker. She's the Richard McCormick Chair of Catholic Moral Theology at Loyola University in Chicago and the Professor of Moral Theology and Social Ethics at Catholic Facility of Frankfurt. Next to me is Dr. Lino Paula, who's the Policy Officer at the EC and the Directorate General for Research and Innovation, the Unit on Ethics and Gender. And we've had a lot of interactions with Lino on international projects and studies pertaining to the governance and ethics of life science. When we were trying to design this, it was a real challenge because if you've seen these reports, there are hundreds of pages. There's over 40 recommendations, and we're trying to figure out how can we possibly go through all of this in an hour and a half or so. So we thought it'd be more easy and maybe a little bit more engaging if the work of both the President's Commission and the EGE was taken from a kind of personal point of view. We provided you with kind of a crib sheet of all the recommendations. This is kind of a subjective analysis side by side of where there's some overlap. But we thought it'd be interesting if we asked the members of these groups to talk about maybe 2 or 3 of the recommendations that they would like to highlight for whatever reason. If they thought they were particularly interesting, controversial, they may lead to far-reaching impacts, that was up to them. And so you'll get, I think, a little bit more personal view of what it was like to be in these groups, both in the U.S. and Europe. We've asked Dr. Paula at the end to sort of begin our discussion on comparisons by talking a little bit about sort of some of the higher level framing issues that came out in these reports. If you read them, there's terms like prudent vigilance and the precautionary principle and responsible stewardship. It's not clear how those interact, what they mean in terms of actual policies. So I think that would be a fairly good way to begin the discussion. Before we actually open up for Q&As, I'll take you through a very quick, this is another higher level analysis, just of where we found overlap, where there was some overlap, but there seemed to be some disagreements about what it actually would mean if it was implemented. And then we have a whole list of things where it looks like the EU and the US didn't particularly agree. They had different priorities, and I think those are interesting to look at. As always, because we're webcasting this, we welcome questions from wherever. whoever's looking in. You can send those to synbio@wilsoncenter.org. It's SYNBIO at wilsoncenter.org. In the subject line, please put bioethics question. And if everything works as I hope it will, it ends up in my PDA, and we can actually get some input from whoever is out there looking. So I'm going to basically, we'll start, and we're going to just go down the row. So I'm going to go all the way over to Dr. Allen and let her begin.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. Dr. Christine Grady and I have been asked to present 2 or 3 of the recommendations of the President's Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, about which we feel strongly or that we thought raised interesting questions among the Commission. As I think probably most of you know, the President's Commission consists of an interdisciplinary group of about a dozen scientists, doctors, lawyers, educators, and public figures who have been brought together to advise President Obama on the ethical issues that flow from today's bioethical science and technology concerns. We decided to take up the issue of synthetic biology just a few weeks after the commission was initially announced in April of 2010. In May of 2010, the Craig Ventner Institute revealed that it had created the world's first self-replicating human-made, that is, synthetic genome in the bacterial cell of a different host species. The president thought, and I think we all agreed, that the ethical significance of Dr. Ventner's achievement merited some assessment. And he felt, and we agreed, that 2010 was a good time to address emerging technologies that aim to apply standardized engineering technologies to biology and therewith create organisms or biological systems with a novel or specialized function to address human needs. And those needs, of course, can include the need for medicines or the need for energy and biofuels. So after meeting in public sessions for several days over a period of about 5 months, the Commission came to a consensus on 5 general principles relevant to considering the implications of emerging technologies. And those 5 principles were public beneficence, responsible stewardship, intellectual freedom and responsibility, democratic deliberation, and justice and fairness. I personally, we've been asked to speak on a personal level, I personally was very pleased that we came up with a fresh set of bioethical principles and that we avoided the perhaps easier path of attempting to mechanically apply well-known, well-existed, well-discussed ideas, because those ideas, those principles that are sort of ready at hand, were really developed in the context of clinical medicine and human subject research. And we felt that we should start from scratch, and we may have overlapping principles, as we indeed do, but we didn't want to assume that the old bioethical principles that everyone knows about, learned about in grad school, were the same ones that we should be applying to this highly innovative and new technology issue. Let me then just talk very, very briefly about one issue that I thought the Commission had lively debate about, and then 2 that I found personally of special importance and interest. The Commission had an especially lively set of exchanges of the recommendation that we classified under the principle of responsible stewardship, recommendation number 10. I think all of the recommendations under that section, 4 through 10, were very, very lively discussed. But I think that recommendation number 10, which calls for ongoing evaluation of objections, was especially almost contentious, but I'd say especially lively. There, the concern was that we shouldn't downplay the importance of ethical concerns that were of more intrinsic character, and that we not overplay the more utilitarian or pragmatic moral concerns, the more pragmatic policy concerns with a little ethical tinge. So here in the United States, there's a lot of concern about people playing God and about moral hubris. And so we wanted our report to reflect having taken seriously these more intrinsic and somewhat less tangible ethical concerns at the same time that we were showing concern for human welfare and human improvement. So, but how do you deal with concerns about playing God without artificially constraining science? I think we reached a nice balance. I hope that you find the report shows that we worked very hard to get a grip on the most powerful ethical objections in SynBio, and that we discerned how those objections play into the current discourse and what sort of behavior, what sort of conduct they require at this juncture. And I think that after a great deal of reading and listening and discussing, we got it right, that we took seriously the spiritual and intrinsic value arguments advanced, and that we gave those appropriate weight at this time. I think that, in the European context, I know that human dignity, especially in Germany, is taken very seriously. We didn't want to give short shrift to those concerns, nor again this idea of moral humility. I think we did come up with some principles that suggest that we should continue to examine and re-examine all of the ethical concerns, even those that are somewhat less tangible, as we move forward, but to not right now allow concerns about playing God or about human dignity to stop the science in its track. Now let me say a little bit about a couple of recommendations about which I felt strongly. Recommendation number 3 was one of the 3 that we made under the frame of the principle of public beneficence. And this one calls for innovation through sharing. This recommendation bears on intellectual property regimes. And I must say I was incredibly intimidated by the prospect of having to say something, having the commission say something meaningful about what sort of intellectual property regimes should be adopted, amended, and so forth in light of synthetic biology. But basically the idea here is that the fruits of innovation are a public good, that whether it's talking about medicine or fuel or new foods, these are public goods, and they deserve to be made available to the public on a fair and equal basis, and that innovation, though may require some degree of proprietary control, but we don't want to have a situation in which, although the public has contributed to the funding of basic science, and although the public needs and benefits from the products of basic science, they're somehow cut off from those by overly proprietary regimes of intellectual property. So these 2 concerns about the fruits of innovation being public goods and concerns about the fact that the funding for a lot of the basic research came from public dollars motivates, I think, this idea that we should be making sure that we have mechanisms through which sharing occurs. Licensing, patenting, and licensing. So we don't come out against patenting in this report, but we do, I think, express a kind of a bias in favor of liberal licensing schemes that make it more likely that the benefits, again, of this research will redound to the good of the public. The second recommendation about which I felt strongly was recommendation number 11, which was labeled promoting intellectual freedom and responsibility. And, I think ethicists often worry about these, concerns about human dignity and about people being treated with respect and concern, and that we not overstep in the realm of science. But I think another equally compelling set of concerns has to do with what sort of professional and corporate ethics are called for by work in emerging technology fields. And I saw this recommendation as addressing those kinds of concerns. We want individuals who do research in this area. We want companies, firms that are engaged in scientific research to do so in an ethical and responsible way. And that means that we would like them to engage in best practices. We'd like them to be mindful of existing codes of ethics and to adhere to them. And we'd like them to self-regulate, to self-modulate their conduct, to adhere to what are received wisdoms about how best to proceed. But as we've seen a lot in the last 20 years in the world of business ethics in particular, and also individual ethics, people don't always do what they ought to do, even when the rules are right in front of them. So I do think that another important part of our recommendation in the area of promoting intellectual freedom and responsibility, and is allowing a space for government oversight. We do, I think, need to have the government play an important role here in making sure that companies and individuals, I think most of whom are well-intended, are adhering to important and basic ethical standards that are important for protecting the public interest and promoting the public good. So we call for, in the report, a kind of central coordinating office that would take responsibility for oversight in this important field. So because I'm first, I want to make sure I don't go over in time. So I've tried to be extremely brief. I could say a lot more about both these recommendations, but I'm going to not do that right now. But I look forward to having a chance to take part in the broader conversation.
Great. So I'll go next. I first want to start by thanking the Wilson Center for the opportunity to participate in this symposium and acknowledge that I feel very honored actually to be a member of the President's Commission and honored to be here as a member of that commission. As Anita said, we were asked to talk about 2 or 3 of the Commission's recommendations that each of us feels strongly about and explain why. And I'm going to do that, but I wanted to start also with some preliminary observations about the Commission's study of synthetic biology. First, recognizing that exploring the world of synthetic biology in about 6 months' time, which is what we did, is a very formidable task. And for those of you who have been working in this field for years, you might think, wow, how did they do that? For some of us, it was a very steep learning curve. We had a lot of good resources, and as part of the process, actually, we had the privilege of learning from people, experts, who have done exceptional work in the science and the ethics, who have studied, debated, and articulated the issues that are related to synthetic biology and other emerging technologies. And that was really absolutely essential to us understanding what the field was about. Among the impressive array of people who generously took the time to testify to the Commission was David Rajewski, who organized this symposium today, and he is here at the Wilson Center. And I truly appreciated the perspective and the knowledge that he brought to the Commission at the hearings that we had. Before getting to my specific recommendations that I feel strongly about, I also want to say something about the 5 principles that Anita already referred to. Because as any of you who have read the report know, we proposed 5 principles as relevant to the consideration of the social and ethical implications of synthetic biology and possibly other emerging technologies. Now, these principles are not unfamiliar, and also they are certainly not limited in their application to synthetic biology or even other emerging technologies. However, I think as a group of principles, they actually provide a useful framework to help us focus our deliberation and activities. And the report actually says, and I quote, "The principles are intended to illuminate and guide public policy choices to ensure that new technologies, including synthetic biology, can be developed in an ethically responsible manner." I was going to say what the 5 are, but Anita's already done that, so I'll skip that part. And I want to just say that I think all 5 are important. I think they're synergistic as well, and hopefully they're useful as an organizing structure for thinking about synthetic biology. But I would actually particularly like to highlight the inclusion of 2 principles, which I believe that when we're thinking about or talking about scientific progress, are less often acknowledged than the others. And these are responsible stewardship and democratic deliberation. And I'm going to say a word about each of those, hopefully not preempting the later discussion, but the recommendations that I selected to focus on as well fall under those 2 areas. So I want to say a little bit about responsible stewardship. The responsibility towards others and our environment when advancing science, including future others. There's a quote in the report that I think is actually interesting to focus on. It says that responsible stewardship can be interpreted operationally as a response to the following question: what can and should we, as a society, do in response to the emerging field of synthetic biology to be responsible stewards of nature, the Earth's bounty, human health and well-being, and the world's safety, now and in the future? Now, that's a very lofty question, but I actually do believe that it is the question that we should keep always centrally in our minds as we're moving forward on scientific progress in synthetic biology. Further, as you probably know from reading it, responsible stewardship calls for something that we call prudent vigilance, which is this sort of practical, sensible care and caution, a way to sort of balance, if that's the right way to think about it, enthusiasm for the science and caution and vigilance about the science. And we called for prudent vigilance in establishing processes for assessing likely benefits and risks both before and after projects are undertaken, and for limiting projects and scientific exploration when necessary. And as you know, the Commission endorsed neither a moratorium on synthetic biology until all risks are identified, nor unfettered freedom for scientific exploration consistent with a more proactionary scientific progress is good, let's go until we find risks or risks or harms that slow us down. But rather, the Commission endorsed a middle ground of ongoing prudent vigilance that carefully monitors, identifies, and takes steps to mitigate harms and potential harms over time. The second principle I'd like to highlight, I already mentioned, is democratic deliberation. And again, I think this is also something that we sometimes hear about, but not always hear about in the context of thinking about principles that guide scientific progress. And democratic deliberation is recognizes a responsibility to engage the public in the development and implementation of specific policies, as well as in a broader ongoing conversation about science, society, values, and technology. So again, I'm going to just read from the report because I think it's well written. The principle of democratic deliberation reflects an approach to collaborative decision-making that embraces respectful debate of opposing views and active participation by citizens. At the core of democratic deliberation is an ongoing public exchange of ideas, particularly regarding the many topics in science and elsewhere in which competing views are advocated, often passionately. A process of active deliberation and justification promotes an atmosphere for debate and decision-making that looks for common ground whenever possible and seeks to cultivate mutual respect where irreconcilable differences remain. It encourages participants to adopt a societal perspective over individual interests, with careful attention to the processes through which decisions are reached and justified. Democratic deliberation promotes outcomes that are inclusive, thoughtfully considered, and respectful of competing views. So you can see why I like this principle. So now I'm going to turn to my assignment, which was selecting a couple of recommendations. And I want to also confess that in the commission discussions and in the shaping of the report, I was one of the commissioners, but not the only one, who felt strongly, actually, that the commentary and explanation surrounding the recommendations was important to understanding what the recommendations were. And so you may have noted that even in the executive summary, there is no list of recommendations. They're interspersed with commentary, which I think was important. And I should recognize our executive director over here who did yeoman's work in making this report happen. So in my view, one of our most important recommendations, which falls under the principle of responsible stewardship, is number 4. As the report notes, responsible stewardship requires clarity, coordination, and accountability across the government. So although the Commission didn't think that we as a federal government in the United States needed a new agency or a new oversight authority, we did recommend that the Executive Office of the President, in consultation with existing federal agencies, develop what we called a clear, defined, and coordinated approach. And this approach to synthetic biology could then leverage existing resources through coordinated reviews and continuing reviews to ensure that the regulatory requirements were consistent and non-contradictory, and to inform the public on a periodic and timely basis. We offered in the report a couple of suggestions for where this entity might be located, but stressed perhaps more importantly that essentially it needed to have sufficient authority to bring together all parts of the government with a stake in synthetic biology, and sufficiently authoritative to effectively engage with or supervise engagement with foreign governments. So actually, picking number 4 as an important, as I think one of the most important recommendations, is sort of a clever trick on my part, because as any of you who have read the report know, there are many other recommendations in our report that actually assign responsibilities to this entity that we call for in number 4, including reviewing, licensing, and sharing practices to promote innovation, which Anita talked about, risk assessment review and gap analysis, review and identification of reliable methods of monitoring and containment, international collaboration, periodic evaluation and revision of the oversight mechanisms, and helping to create a culture of responsible stewardship through appropriate ethics training for scientists and others. The other recommendation that I would like to highlight in the few minutes I have left is actually fall under democratic deliberation, and I would particularly like to point to numbers 14 and 16. So 14 calls for engagement of scientists, policymakers, religious leaders, and the public and civil society groups in ongoing deliberation about these issues. So it very much relates to what Anita was talking about in terms of attending seriously to the kinds of moral objections that some people do have about synthetic biology. Recommendation 14 recognizes the need for ongoing public dialogue and respectful consideration of the views of the public, the scientists, the policymakers, religious leaders, and others, and recognizes the need for collaborative decision-making, including dialogue about potential moral or religious concerns or objections. As described, democratic deliberation is an approach to collaborative decision-making that embraces respectful debate of opposing views and active participation by citizens. And since synthetic biology has the potential to affect everybody, both the benefits and the potential risks, it's important for everybody to be involved in the discussion. And I think that it's really important to engage the public as much as possible in that discussion. Now, the Wilson Center, I think, is an example of a group that has done a phenomenal job of engaging the public on this and related issues. And I remember a comment, actually, that David Drzeski made at the testimony that he gave to us last July. It was after he had presented data that came out of the research they had done through focus groups and national surveys, and he was talking about the views of the public about synthetic biology. And he made a statement that was something like, "I am constantly impressed by people." It was something as simple as that. And I thought it was such a great statement because it just basically says, you know, everybody has something to say. So we really ought to be listening to everybody. I think public engagement, and nobody in this room I'm sure would disagree, has a lot of interesting challenges. And it's not a straightforward kind of thing. The last recommendation I want to highlight, which I think is very related, is number 16, which is related to public education. And I think in order to have meaningful public engagement and citizen participation in deliberations about synthetic biology and other kinds of scientific endeavors, the public needs to be familiar with scientific concepts and be literate in science and in ethical considerations as well. So I think number 16 talks about expanding educational activities related to synthetic biology to diverse populations of students at all levels, civil society organizations, communities, and other groups. These activities are most effective when encouraged and supported by various sources, not only the government, but also private foundations and grassroots scientific and civic organizations. And then we have some recommendations about how that ought to proceed. I have to confess, actually, that one of my soapboxes in life in general is science education and science literacy, and this really fits right in with that, in addition, of course, to ethical literacy, since that's where I live. I also want to recognize that although this is a very important goal, it is a challenging goal as well, because science education requires, and public education in science requires, lots of innovation and creativity and is challenged by a lot of different forces that sort of play against it. So again, I remember something from David's testimony that I think was really interesting. It was a Gary Larson cartoon with a scientist talking to a person about synthetic biology. And the scientist was explaining, and the words of the scientist were an explanation of synthetic biology. And the other caption was what the person heard. And what the person heard was synthetic, blah, 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 life, blah, 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 blah. And that's, I think, a really great example of the challenge to public education. Thank you.
Let me first thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion with the US side. My name is Hille Haker, and I want to introduce you a little bit to the European report on synthetic biology, and I will make my comments with a comparative view on the US report. Okay, so we were earlier. Our report, or our opinion, as we call our reports, was issued already in 2009. So probably we need to keep that in mind too. The EGE usually has two anchors that it needs to consider. The first anchor is the Lisbon Treaty now and the European legislation, but I will turn to that in a minute. Also the European Union Fundamental Charter of Fundamental Rights. That's the first anchor, and the EGE issued the opinion on synthetic biology after having worked on quite a few other opinions already. So we were not in the beginning of our work, but it was actually the last opinion of the last group, and the new group has just been newly established this year. The second anchor, however, is the European citizens. And I think Lena will talk about the Eurobarometer and the public opinion in European Union about synthetic biology a little bit more. But every opinion that the EGE issues is accompanied by a public hearing, a roundtable discussion where everyone can go to. And of course, all the members of the group are very well aware of the, let's say, the views and the opinions and the diversity, the cultural diversity and societal diversity in the European Union. Since Lena will do that, I will not talk about the Eurobarometer or the European citizens' views on synthetic biology, but the EGE stated in the beginning that there is a vast lack of knowledge about synthetic biology, and that is of course not surprising given that we were working on that in 2009. But we need to acknowledge that even when we run these polls and so on, it could be that people answer questions that they do not really understand what implications they have and so on. And this is not bashing the public, it is just to state the obvious, because we too had to be informed, had to be educated about the scientific side, also about the legal regulations. Synthetic biology, after all, is a very complicated matter. So let me state the second anchor. What framework does the EGE touch upon, and what framework does it presuppose? This is and I will not talk about the legal framework, it is an ethical framework. And since you too emphasized rightly, in my opinion, the importance of your 5 principles, let me just state how we approach that. And since I was also asked to say something from my personal point of view, we took about 4 years to develop our own approach in the Ethics Commission or on the EGE, trying to really get to grips with what kind of a framework is appropriate and adequate in responding responsibly to the new technologies, and that this, of course, is an ongoing process, is self-understanding. So what we did is actually we, I think, worked more and more in the course of our different opinions with a human rights framework. Why did we do so? You alluded to the concept of dignity that is held so highly in Germany. No. Yes, it is, but it is actually the principle, the foundational, fundamental principle of the European Union. It is the first principle of the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights. So dignity is, in a way, the perspective with which everything that ethically matters is to be seen. And having been in Europe and the US, I know that there is some difficulty in understanding exactly the traditions, the different traditions of dignity in Europe and in the US. I will not go into that, but I can say this. In the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, dignity is spelled out or translates into specific human rights, and there are especially 6 areas, and the one is exactly dignity, but it is also different kinds of freedoms. They are spelled out in the charter. It is equality, it is solidarity, it is citizens' rights and justice. And if you compare these principles to the 5 principles that you have, I would say a little bit provocative that in reading the US report, I would say that you define responsibility a little bit more in light of or in view of public good and public beneficence, whereas the EGE spells out or translates or considers responsibility a little bit more in light of citizens and human rights. Now, that can easily become an academic discussion here, but in a way, the 2 connotations, rather public beneficence, rather humans and citizens' rights, is actually an important difference. It is not difficult to overcome it. It is more nuances than really a big divide in the ethical approaches. I would grant that, but the EGE certainly took this kind of a human dignity spelled out as human rights and citizens' rights approach in the different opinions, also in synthetic biology. And we added several other principles that try to explain this approach further. That is sustainability, that is precaution, that we will be talking about later on, I guess. It is the freedom of research and the principle of proportionality. We added these principles to explain that these are the ethical reference points that we use when we go into detail. And for example, the principle of proportionality, which says nothing as a word, means that the goal that science is promoting must be important. So we want an analysis of the goals of, for example, synthetic biology. We want to assess whether the methods to achieve the goals are necessary. And third, we want to make sure that no less controversial or risky methods are out there to achieve these goals. Okay, so that is only the principle of proportionality. If we would apply that now, it gets much more teeth than it seems to be when we only work with these big words like dignity, human rights, responsibility, precaution, and so on. So let me turn to a few more detailed aspects. We said, of course, that this framework translates into the concern, and there's a lot common ground there. Concern for the protection of safety, concern for the protection of biosecurity, also the prevention of bioterrorism and dual use. And I personally was a little bit surprised that the U.S. Commission said so little on the security measure and said most of all about biosafety. The EGE, and that is the first big difference, I think. We had a lot of discussions about biosecurity and not only biosafety. So maybe there's a reason behind it, but we certainly wanted to the European Commission and the European Union to address the problem of biosecurity. Actually, if I can just say that, there's one recommendation about biosecurity or security that actually calls, and that's the only recommendation that does so, to amend the Convention on Bioweapons. So that is an amendment to so-called hard law. and not only like other recommendations to soft law, like code of conduct for biosafety and overall assessment of safety regulations and so on. But in biosecurity, actually, we called for an amendment of the Convention of Bioweapons. And if I understand that correctly, it is being taken up now. And so because we were earlier than the US, I was a little bit frustrated, to be honest, that the US Commission didn't back us in that respect. But maybe we can talk about it. With respect to biosafety, I think we will have a discussion now. The EGE was probably, also prudently vigilant as, vigilant as the US Commission, but we went actually further. Due to the fact that the precautionary principle is something that the European Union upholds. What does the precautionary principle say? I guess that you will talk about it a little bit further. For us, it means that there must be irreversible effects, and in this case, the burden of proof will be reversed, so that the possible benefits must be really explicitly stated. So there are many definitions about the precautionary principle. We did not emphasize it too much in our opinion, because it is already there in the legislation of the European Union, but rather said what we want is a comprehensive governance framework, and we want a study provided by the European Commission about impact assessment. Impact assessment is a word that we use. Sometimes it was replaced by a risk assessment, but what we have in mind is that risk assessment is only one part of an impact assessment. And we had a lot discussion about what does risk assessment in synthetic biology and more general in the new technology, what is it actually about, and do we need a new framework? So we said, before, for example, there can be a release to the environment, we want a study, long-term risk assessment and impact assessment, risk management, risk communication, and the more technical risk assessment. We also want to take into consideration the more cultural and social effects. And I think that in that respect, I would defend our opinion a little bit over against the US report, because I think our concept of risk assessment was a little bit broader. And the big difference, of course, is that, at least as I read it, that the US report wants periodic risk assessment and an interagency process to discuss risk assessment, whereas the EGE opinion asks for current risk assessment prior to the financing and marketing of synthetic biology. There is a recommendation on research. We want basic research, even though you cannot really distinguish it from applied research, but the direction is clear of the recommendations, and the precautionary principle, if you want to put it in these words, asks for risk assessment and impact assessment prior rather than ongoing risk assessment. I think concerning safety, this is the main big difference between the EGE report and the US report, because we condition the funding and financing of synthetic biology on this framework. We also, and that is the second point I want to make, is that our approach to governance is probably a little bit more a little bit tougher than the self-regulation approach that the US report takes. That might be due to the fact that European citizens actually want a tough regulation framework. So when I said we have two anchors, one, the legislation, but also the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the European citizens, then we, in that respect, we can turn to the European citizens who actually only support synthetic biology, nanotechnology, and all these new technologies if a very good regulatory framework is in place. And we actually consented to that. Okay, our approach actually called for an international approach and international efforts. So that relates to the WTO and trade regulations, also international dialogue on, let's say, intellectual property rights. It is a very, very complex field and complicated matters, of course, because of different regulations. But what we thought is really, really needed here is an international, at least an international dialogue and some attempts to, if not harmonize, but at least to discuss what kinds of safety measures and what kinds of regulations are to be put into place with regard to import, export questions, and so on. So we actually wanted in 2009 that the WTO and other international agencies, authorities, committees, and so on take this up in order to not to have a regional approach, but rather an international approach. Many, many, many more things I could talk about in the discussion. I would like to comment a little bit more on the science and society dialogue, because I feel quite strong about that as an ethicist. We don't say education of the public, because we think that actually in synthetic biology there is the question of the concept of life at stake again. It's not that the public is maybe too uneducated to understand what is going on in the life sciences. No, we said there is actually a conceptual question, and maybe I can come back to that in the discussion, not to take too much time here. Okay, so far.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center for organizing this event. And I would also like to thank both the U.S. Presidential Commission and the EGE for their valuable contribution to the policy discussion about synthetic biology. I think that the fact that we have these two reports already at such an early stage of the development of synthetic biology, rather than at the end of the pipeline when the product is already arriving in the market, shows that how much progress in itself has already been made in the field of bioethics and the governance of science and technology. Now, this morning, I would like to highlight the convergence between your two reports, both on the issues of substance and on the issues of procedure. I think that is very interesting also in looking towards the future on how we can jointly approach these developments. So, I see agreement on what needs to be addressed, issues such as biosafety, biosecurity, intellectual property issues that are mentioned there, but also I see agreement on how we need to address and govern these issues, namely via a process of democratic deliberation, public dialogue, stakeholder participation, and education. So I would like to focus on this second aspect of convergence, and so that deals with the governance of synthetic biology. I do this also because I work for a program within the Director General for Research and Innovation of the European Commission, which is called the Science and Society Program, and we actually work a lot on these issues of governance. And I would like to explain a little bit more about what we do there. So please allow me to first say a few words about the approach that we take in this program, and then I would like to highlight two elements in the reports that I think are important for the future governance of synthetic biology, and also for public policy on new and emerging science and technology in general. Now, these two elements that I would like to highlight in the reports are what the US Presidential Commission has called prudent vigilance and responsible stewardship, and how I think that these concepts are actually quite well aligned with European positions. And second, the challenges and conditions for establishing a constructive societal dialogue. First, however, some information on what we do. And generally, as you may know, we have an explicit regulatory framework on genetically modified organisms in Europe. And it is the current position of the Commission that for the current synthetic biology activities, in terms of biosafety, this framework is sufficient. So there are no ongoing regulatory initiatives at the moment, but obviously we follow these developments very closely, and also our scientific and biosafety committees function in the same way that they follow and monitor developments. But we have a number of non-regulatory activities ongoing, and especially in the program that I work for, the Science and Society program. Now, the philosophy behind the activities in this program is to encourage early two-way dialogue with stakeholders, to internalize ethical and social aspects in the design of new projects and new products and practices. And there are a number of reasons why we take this approach. One is the obvious inherent difficulty to timely and effectively address and regulate a complex and fast-moving field like synthetic biology. You cannot easily do that via law. Law takes long to adopt and long to amend. Another reason is that top-down, say, command and control types of regulation are not the most effective in our democratic and complex society. And thirdly, ethical and social issues are not so easily addressed in a legal context, and you cannot easily set aspirations via legal frameworks. Now, there are also obviously positive reasons to give why we should put emphasis on societal dialogue with stakeholders. First is the argument of democracy. The impact of these developments will affect us all, so everybody should have a say in how we regulate and deal with these developments. Second, the involvement of different stakeholders can actually contribute to the quality of the assessments and the decisions being made. We all have our own respective knowledges. Some have more, say, dedicated professional scientific knowledge, but also knowledge from practice is very important in regulating these developments. And thirdly, also it increases, and that is more an interest for us as policymakers, involvement of stakeholders obviously also increases the chance that you will get support and commitment to the policies that are actually being decided upon. So our activities focus on establishing conditions for this early stakeholder involvement and dialogue, and we do it via a range of activities, especially, say, non-hard law activities. We stimulate research on the ethical, legal, and social aspects of science and technology, and we have several projects also running on synthetic biology. And actually, there is a workshop being organized in April next month in Brussels by one of our projects that deals with the more health applications of synthetic biology. But we have also various other projects, and one is actually a survey that we do on European public opinion. And I cheated a little bit because you will have received a handout with slides of that study. It's actually from this report, Europeans and Biotechnology in 2010, and it contains a lot of information on public opinion on synthetic biology as well. So you have got the handouts here. Maybe in the discussion we'll discuss a bit further. I won't go into it in detail now, but it's interesting to see in the study that indeed the European public is not very much aware yet of synthetic biology. So in that sense, we have the opportunity to have an open and constructive discussion, yet without preconceived judgments. Furthermore, besides these more, say, research and fact-finding activities, we promote capacity building among stakeholders. We organize several networks. For example, the NEC Forum. It's a forum of national ethics councils in Europe, which also has joint meetings with the European Group on Ethics. It's a kind of exchange of best practice in the field of ethics review, but also a way of capacity building for some of the member states. We do similar things with stakeholders and also with local research ethics committees. And we promote international dialogue via workshops and also collaborations with international organizations like the WHO and UNESCO. Another publications I have brought with me is this of a meeting we had in Mexico City in 2009. National Bioethics Committees in Action. It was again a capacity building conference with national bioethics committees from all over the world. And just last year, together with WHO, we had a meeting in Singapore, the Global Summit of National Ethics Advisory Bodies, where the EC hosted a session on synthetic biology, where the EGE was present, and also very kindly the president of the US Presidential Commission, Dr. Amy Goodman, gave a presentation on the US activities. So via these ways, we promote this both exchange of best practice, capacity building, and also informing and involving stakeholders. Now, we do also some kind of additional, say, self-regulation type of activities, like promoting codes of conducts among scientists, and similarly, we also carry out our own ethics review. So for all the projects that the Commission funds, we carry out an ethics review if it is felt that there are ethics issues to be addressed. So clearly, we do already a lot of what the EGE, the European Group on Ethics, and the US Presidential Commission would like us to do, fortunately. So in that sense, I think the most important observation I can make today is that there is this convergence of positions also from our side, and that we can use this common ground to seek transatlantic collaboration. And in that light, I also want to make two observations that I think are relevant to furthering this transatlantic dialogue. First is the importance of definitions for policy and for dialogue on synthetic biology. How can we actually concretely define notions like the US notion of prudent vigilance and responsible stewardship in a way that they can be applied in policy and have an impact on how the field of synthetic biology develops? I don't have the magical answer to that, actually, but I do feel that in Europe efforts have been made to come to a concrete implementation of some concepts and policy. And here I'm indeed referring to the precautionary principle. I do feel that in the Presidential Commission's report, not full justice has been done to the precautionary principle. In the report, in my interpretation, the impression is given that the precautionary principle stands for moratoria, and that it stands in the way of scientific progress, and that kind of is referred to in the US report on page 123. Now, this is not really how the Commission defines the principle. And actually, how the way the Commission defines the principle is quite similar to how the US Presidential Commission defines prudent vigilance. So I don't want to bore you too much with our rather prosaic use of English in the Commission, but nevertheless, I would like to kind of highlight some key aspects of the definition just to show how, in my view, closely the precautionary principle can actually come to what the US Commission calls prudent vigilance. So let me give you some extracts of the definition. So we define it as the implementation of an approach based on the precautionary principle should start with a scientific evaluation, as complete as possible, and where possible, identifying at each stage the degree of scientific uncertainty. Where action is deemed necessary, measures based on the precautionary principle should be, inter alia, proportional to the chosen level of protection, non-discriminatory in their application, consistent with similar measures already taken, based on an examination of the potential benefits and cost of action or lack of action, subject to review in the light of new scientific data. So this is kind of also the reiterative approach that the US Presidential Commission has suggested. Furthermore, capable of assigning responsibility for producing the scientific evidence necessary for a more comprehensive risk assessment. And let me just highlight that last element, because I think that is also where there is kind of this stereotypic idea that nothing can be done until everything is known. That's not really the case. How we do it is that for assigning responsibility for producing scientific evidence, first it has to be acknowledged that it is already a common consequence of these methods. Countries that impose a prior approval market authorization requirement on products that they deem dangerous a priori also reverse the burden of proof by treating them as dangerous unless and until business do the scientific work necessary to demonstrate that they are safe. So, for example, for medical products, there is already this reversal of the burden of proof. So it's not something exclusive to the precautionary principle as such. And where there is no prior authorization procedure, it may be up to the user or the public or to public authorities to demonstrate the nature of a danger and the level of risk of a product or process. In such cases, a specific precautionary measure might be taken to place the burden of proof upon the producer, manufacturer, or importer, but this cannot be made a general rule. So just to show you that the precautionary principle is actually quite more balanced than some people think it is. Turning now to the related concept of responsible stewardship, I think that the values behind that notion are also broadly shared in Europe. And in my directorate, we are currently developing a similar concept that we call responsible research and innovation. This is kind of very much similar to what the U.S. Presidential Commission calls responsible stewardship. And in May, we will organize a participatory workshop with stakeholders to actually come to further define what is to be understood under this principle and how responsible research and innovation can actually be more implemented in policy, and what kind of policy initiatives could be taken to arrive at it. Second observation, and that is what this observation I would like to make with regard to the challenge to have a balanced public dialogue. There are several recommendations in both reports that in my view, give rise to further questions. The EGE recommends, in its recommendation number 21 and 22, that the media should promote responsible reporting, and that the Commission, the European Commission, should help educate the media. Now, the US Presidential Commission calls for information accuracy in their recommendation number 15. They call for a fact-check organization run by impartial, qualified experts and funded by private sources without conflicts of interest. Now, let me state that I fully appreciate the intention of these recommendations and that they really point to very important issues. However, I do feel that some of the challenges and assumptions here could have been more explicitly acknowledged. For example, the issue of better education and better scientific literacy. Again, I can point to the Eurobarometer survey to show you that better education and literacy does not necessarily mean that you will have more support for synthetic biology. That's also a misunderstanding, and there's a great body of knowledge coming from a field called the public understanding of science, that actually better understanding can reinforce negative sentiment towards a certain technology if it is perceived to be harmful. So you will find in the data on the Eurobarometer, for example, that also people with a scientific education or either having family, having relatives involved in science, can actually have very negative opinions to, for example, genetically modified food. You do see sometimes that people with a scientific education are relatively more positive than people without scientific education, but overall they can still be very negative actually towards certain scientific development. I think another aspect we shouldn't underestimate is the social and psychological dynamics. We live in an individualistic society where also the media is quite segmented, and people tend to listen and believe the news that confirms their pre-existing views. So that is another challenge to deal with. And the media is also, of course, a challenge in itself. Can we help or educate the media? Actually, in Hungary, in Europe, there was a big controversy because government actually wanted to impose certain rules on the media because the Hungarian government felt that the media there was not respectful and accurate enough in terms of covering the political news. Now, there was a very huge backlash against that initiative, not only in Hungary but in Europe in general. So I think this shows that it is not so self-evident for a governmental organization to get involved in what the media should say or do, and how do you define responsible reporting. I think that every news organization will find that it does that. And just to give you examples from your own environment, Fox News carries the slogan "fair and balanced," and I'm sure that they feel that they do that, but there are members here that think that they don't. And I know that there are similar discussions at the moment about funding for National Public Radio. They are also being accused of a certain bias. So it's very difficult, I would say, to define what is responsible reporting and who should define it. Another issue I think is important in dialogue, in societal dialogue, is the issue of epistemology. I think that one should not underestimate the fact that in these situations of new science and technology, factual information is simply not always available. And where it is available, it is often inconclusive, and it remains inconclusive. There's a high degree of uncertainty. So factual information cannot always give you the answer that you would like to have, and it cannot be leading to a conclusion. And also, in these discussions, there are also very many normative assumptions and issues at stake. What risks are acceptable? The question of whether a risk is acceptable is not a factual question, but a normative question. So factual information can help you, but it will not lead you to a conclusion. You cannot resolve that discussion by facts. But even if those facts are available, there's also a big body of an important body of knowledge in the sociology of science that actually shows that also scientific information to a certain extent is socially constructed. And Bruno Latour has written a lot of books about that, the French philosopher. To put it in other words, who is going to fact check the fact checkers? Who is going to decide who is really impartial and what the truth is? And I would just like to refer to one of your own political pundits called Stephen Colbert. He said the truth is known to have a liberal bias. So there you go. So public dialogue is not free from such serious challenges, and I do think we need to think very hard how we can make it work and who can play what role in that dialogue. But let me conclude by stressing again that I do think that both reports are very good starting points for taking on these challenges, and given the convergence between them that I see, I do feel that I can say with a high degree of certainty and factuality that we can face these challenges together in a close transatlantic collaboration. Thank you.
Okay. I could certainly let the four of you talk for another hour between yourself, but it might be worthwhile just getting a bunch of questions. So if people have questions, want to raise issues, why don't you just raise your hand? We'll get you a microphone because we are webcasting. Yeah, Tim, why don't you just also just identify who you are and where you're from.
Good morning. I'm Tim Persons. I'm the Chief Scientist of the Government Accountability Office. Thank you all for your time and the studies that you all collectively did. This question was more for the EGE perspective. We, GAO, have been doing our own technology assessment on the topic of engineering the climate. And there's this whole idea of just the notion of the precautionary principle that you were all mentioning, and trying to discern that line between when research is allowed relatively unfettered and when it's something that you really need to latch down on in a regulatory regime. And I think Professor Granger Morgan at Carnegie Mellon, when he was talking about engineering the climate, drew this notional three-dimensional box on a Cartesian grid, which said, within this box, the basic research should relatively progress unfettered by oversight and so on. But then outside of the box, once there's an advancement in the science, once you know more, as Dr. Paula pointed out, the epistemologic problems, once you solve some of those, maybe then you start to do that. Is there some line or some box, as it were, that you all are seeing from the EGE perspective in the same way? Thank you.
Well, you know, first of all, the European Union is funding projects on synthetic biology, quite considerably, actually. I think it is about 30 million euros. I think it is euros, not dollars. Yeah, you know, it is considerable. So one could say, even though the ethics group, the EGE, says, and that is our job as an ethics group, famously said, proceed with caution, or something like that, it should not be interpreted as a full-scale moratorium, whether we say that or not. In this respect, we didn't even say that, yeah. But let me just read out again how we try to get a grips with that. We said that any use of synthetic biology should be conditional on specific safety issues identified in this opinion, okay? And therefore, and now we start with a few, but we need to initiate a study on current risk assessment procedures. This means not only do risk assessment, but we really need to reconsider, are we doing the best job that we can in order to on the one hand side, fund research, whether we call it basic research or not, but it basically is basic research, or to make the decision when can we go further. Well, we want really to have a more comprehensive framework that is in place so far. And there is a lot of work being done. I think even here in the Wilson Center, there has been a study on technology assessment and risk assessment, what we call now the impact assessment. But our feeling was somehow the frameworks that have been out there for the last 30, 40 years are not adequate anymore. Okay, so this is why we said, and we said that already when we worked on nanomedicine a few years ago, okay, study. This study should make a survey of relevant biosafety procedures, identify possible gaps in the current biosafety regulations, that is, of course, EU, to effectively assess organisms and novel products developed through synthetic biology and indicate the mechanism to fill the identified gaps. That's the first. The second is the identified risk assessment procedure should then be carried out by the competent authorities. And third, this should be conditional, quite tough. This should be conditional for financing of synthetic biology research and the marketing of synthetic biology products in the EU. Okay? And then international dialogue. So can we have a very, very concrete answer? I would say no. Do we have an answer for the approach that we want to take? Yes, and that concerns the US as well as the EU. EU regulations are there, biosafety regulations are in place, and the report, the US report, states the whole complex matter and so on. There is actually a lot that we can agree upon, yeah. But the framework, it is not only a technological or technical question, but also actually a political and an ethical question how to do that. Much work is being done in the US as well as in Europe, and I think we should really look at that. We had a lot of discussions, ongoing discussions on the EGE, how badly this is needed, a reconsideration of that. Does that help a little bit? Okay.
I don't know if either of you want to answer, because I know the commission heard a lot of issues about do the existing regulations work? Even further upstream, do the existing risk assessment?
Yeah.
Broadly risk assessment, so going beyond just quantitative risk assessment, are those going to be applicable to, for instance, intentional releases of these organisms?
I think we did recognize that the current methods of determining what the risks are may not be adequate for the kinds of things that synthetic biology might be able to create. And so in there is a description of the need to assess the risk assessment measures, basically, and to make sure that they're adequate. And I love the idea that this is impact assessment as opposed to risk assessment, because I think the other idea that makes sense to me, actually, is that, factual measures of risk may be easier to get a handle on than what the impact of those risks are on people, and as Nino said, the acceptability of those risks. So it's a very complicated assessment. But I'd love to hear what the box is in the model that you described. What are the parameters of the box?
So that's always the risk of reporting someone else's work. Of course, the notion was, as far as I understood Professor Morgan's discussion, was just saying there was it would be some risk assessment to define the parameters of the box.
Okay.
And at least with the best known science and ethics and those sorts of things of the moment, you at least draw the box, and then you allow within the box this idea of relatively unfettered research and so on. And outside, once things progress and developments occur, and you know more, then the regulatory regime sort of kicks in and starts to do that. So
it does seem like the understanding the way we measure risk and whether it's adequate to capture what we're worried about in this context is necessary to be able to draw the box, I think, in a certain way.
It sounds like the researcher presumed that there was going to be a lot of stuff in the box, right? And we don't have a good basis for quite knowing that, I think. I mean, hopefully there is an area of unfettered research which can go forward, but I mean, there's a lot of vagueness about what would be in that box. Could I just make a general point? I really like the fact that Dr. Paula amplified what the precautionary principle actually means in the European context. And I think also Dr. Hacker's last remarks helped to show some area of greater convergence than maybe we felt was there when we responded initially to the European report. There does seem to be a lot of common ground here. We all, I think, are very interested in some degree of caution and some degree of prior risk assessment and impact assessment before we move forward with the science. So I think I feel better actually today than I did yesterday about how much genuine conflict there was between the European approach and the U.S. approach. Although I don't want to gloss over the real differences that were pointed out. I think that there is less of a stark contrast. It's not just our way versus their way, but actually the ways are somewhat congruent in important respects.
A few more questions. Yeah, right here.
I'm sorry to say that I come away from this discussion in exactly the opposite mode. I'm very pessimistic about the science addressed here. I'm very pessimistic about the ethics addressed here. I think you were dealing with a political necessity. I say that from 20 years of experience in dealing with low probability, high consequence technological risks, and married to my wife, who is walked the other side, high probability, low consequence environmental risks. We've written together on the concept that risk assessment is virtually useless. What you really should be focusing on is risk management. Risk assessment is involved, but by itself it's useless unless it's firmly anchored to the actual procedures that will be used to control the risk. I felt that except for one remark by Dr. Hacker and some more remarks by Dr. Paula, there was much too little emphasis on the benefit analysis. The benefit analysis is just as detailed and technical, or should be, as and specific as the risk management. And the benefits should be viewed from a management point of view as well. Finally, synthetic biology is not one thing. I was at a 2-day session of the run by the Institute of Medicine about a week ago on synthetic and systematic biology, and the span is so vast that the people can discuss synthetic biology and never have any chance of having an actual conversation because their mental images of what they think it means can be so vastly different. They could be from different planets. If anybody's interested, I would be happy to briefly encapsulate my remarks and suggestions and make them available to any or all of you, but I don't want to take any more time here.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's a bunch of interesting stuff. One is certainly the Commission's heard lots of definitions and perspectives on synthetic biology. The other thing that's important, I think, is the risk management and this issue of the wild cards, the black swans, these things that come out that really are very difficult. Quantitative risk assessment really doesn't help you there. And how do you prepare for those? So I don't know in what order we want to take those. Go ahead.
Yes, I would like to respond to that because I really agree with what you say, and I thought I said risk assessment is more or less a placeholder for a very, very complex thing, including risk management, risk communication. We said in our report too, saying that we're more concerned about an impact assessment, not to go into this trap that it is just one tiny little part, very technical, can be done, and put it into that commission or into that agency, and then you have it, and then whoops, relieve the stuff to the environment, for example. No. we really have deep concerns how we can do that. And a second thing that we said, and we also wanted to add the benefit analysis. Remember, I just alluded to the principle of proportionality, where you assess the goal, assess the methods, assess alternatives. In light of that, you also have to take into consideration cultural diversity. We have seen that in GMO, let's say, productions and different responses to that, and even without taking a fundamental position there, if you do not take into consideration the cultures where you release GMOs or sell GMOs, and the same will be true for SB, chemicals, textiles, what we are talking about. Yeah. What we also said is we want a case-by-case risk assessment. Some people, not the US, on the European side have misunderstood that as a case-by-case, project by project by project. What we meant was you have different areas. You have health, you have energy production, biofuels, you have environment cleanup, you have chemical, textile, cosmetic, and so on, and you have the whole health and medical products and so on. So, and of course, and so it is really a big field that synthetic biology, as for example nanotechnologies and all the convergent technologies, touch upon, and you cannot say one thing for all. This is why I said I was a bit frustrated that biosecurity played such a tiny little role, because biosecurity here, if we talk about impact assessment or the placeholder of risk assessment in biosecurity, all of a sudden what you said doesn't fit exactly either. So we have to be much more specific. If we talk about biofuels, different thing altogether. Yep. Yeah.
I mean, you may want to respond to that also, because there were some issues about just how deeply you would go into biosecurity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I appreciate your comment, and I think we did have a lot of discussion about the difficulty defining synthetic biology and the vast number of activities and areas that are included under that rubric. We also had a lot of discussion about the benefits and the potential benefits of synthetic biology, and the need to really understand whether those purported benefits, how realistic they are, I guess is the way I would say it, which I think is similar to what you're talking about in terms of benefit analysis. And we also did talk a lot about biosecurity, and I'm not sure maybe in the end our specific recommendations didn't highlight it enough in terms of what you're saying. I think actually, as I was looking at the two reports in comparison, it felt like maybe the biggest difference, if I may say, is that a lot of your recommendations were very specific details about, no funding before X happens and that kind of thing, which we didn't get to that level of specificity, but rather put some of those responsibilities on other existing agencies and the creation of this entity that we described. So I have one question for you, though, if I may. You started by saying I'm pessimistic, and so I would like to hear why. Are you pessimistic because we didn't go far enough, because we weren't specific enough, because the concerns are bigger than anybody addressed, or because I think of this as a step. This discussion isn't over as of these reports, but.
Okay. Historically, I come to it a bit pessimistically, because I have seen so many technological evaluations done when I was actively involved in that, which I'm not now, but I've never seen a proper assessment of nuclear power. Never saw any remotely responsible assessment of the Yucca Mountain high level nuclear waste disposal issue. And in talking with other scientists at AAAS meetings and like this, there are a lot of us who feel that way, that people play with these issues and they come in with a preconceived idea of what they think is right. They play out their roles against each other, initially in a quasi-political environment and ultimately in the courts, and then one side wins or another in court or in the battlefield of politics, and that's the way it gets settled. But the type of thing that is being discussed here is almost never decisive in terms of what happens. Then the specificity issue, yes, radically different types of synthetic biology, some of which don't involve any organisms, only organic components to interface with mechanical components, as in information technology. I was a little disappointed in the American report. I love that you brought up, Dr. Allen, the issue of intellectual property. That's another thing I've researched and written on. We have a marvelous resource which I wish had been mentioned in the report, and that's the National Academy of Sciences Board on Research Data and Information. And that is the definitive repository of information and wisdom on intellectual property in U.S. research. And I certainly hope that the Commission will call on them for analysis of that. But that is just one example of many specifics that would have to be addressed. I think also precision in language needs to be demanded of everybody. I see some call for precision of language on the part of the scientists and the part of the proponents of synthetic biology technology. Great, that's appropriate. The same should be applied to the opponents. When somebody talks about playing God, that's okay, but tell us what you mean. Does that include surgery and vaccination, and does it include genetic testing? And can you draw a contrast why this is playing God, but genetic testing is not? I think everybody who's going to deal seriously with this has to be held to the same demand or encouragement to be as precise as they can. Now, some people can be more precise than others, and there's tolerance, of course. But
why don't we
got to get down more to brass tacks, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't we get some more tacks on the table? Let's go. Yeah. Why don't we just pass it down here?
Thank you. Bob McCrae, George Washington University. It struck me that there were four similar challenges up between the two reports that that are of interest and concern for me as a political scientist. The first one, the impact assessment question and the impact management of what other system you come up with. The other one is the role of the public and how deeply, how extensively, to what granularity the public is involved and what mechanisms. The third thing, I guess, is a question of what ethical metrics you may be using to determine, what you consider to be ethical or non-ethical or whatever crosses the line. And then finally, the biosecurity question, which I'm particularly concerned about because I would assume that most countries, in light of the BWC and in light of where things are, would want to be fairly the same spot on biosecurity. But where I think some of the differences exist, though I can't justify them entirely, is some people would argue, well, who structures biosecurity? Who pays for it? Who enforces it? How do you determine what uniform standards should exist both in France and in the United States, for example, that would not only meet our need for conducting positive science research, but also would, in the worst case scenario, if things are dragged into court, we would have similar thresholds of proof and similar burdens of proof in terms of whether somebody exerted whatever emerges as due diligence in biosecurity, because this is a brand new field. It's one thing to define due diligence in business activities and due diligence in others, but what is due diligence in biosecurity? So I would just point out that I think there's those four commonalities in your report, but there's also a tremendous amount of challenge in trying to sharpen and define what we specifically mean in those areas. So I guess my question to the panel after all that is, how do you agree with what I'm saying, or do you feel that there's other issues? Do you think you can close on those 4 issues, or do you see others besides that, or in lieu of that?
I have a couple of responses if you want to hear. Shall I go ahead? Okay,
Yeah.
so very good comments. On the ethical metrics question, you know, this is a big problem for all public bioethics. What metrics do you use? And what meta-ethical metrics do you use? And do your ethical metrics include regard for the religions that people may bring to the table? So, you know, I think that our attempt to articulate 5 ethical principles to guide our analysis here is some attempt to navigate that dangerous terrain, coming up with some notions that people of various backgrounds can subscribe to. I think the Europeans have a similar dilemma, maybe even more complex to the national divergencies that they confront, but ideas like dignity and freedom and equality and solidarity work well as general normative guidelines within Europe, while steering clear of more particular ethical notions that might, raise issues of incommensurables and unbreachable conflicts. On the role of the public, I agree totally with Dr. Grady's remarks earlier about the importance of public education, and I disagree somewhat with Dr. Haker's concerns about assuming that somehow education is a way of avoiding the questions about life that are at stake. Here in the United States, we have a very, very grave problem that our young people are radically undereducated in science. In our cities, 50 to 60% of the children, especially the boys, are not even graduating from high school, let alone going to college or community college. So we have a very serious problem of making sure that our public understands the basics of science. And on that foundation, they can have a voice, a better education. They can have a voice in the political process that will enable them to matter when it comes to how we move forward in some of these issues. I'll just stop there.
Mm.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I like your 4 areas. I would like actually a 5th area, and that is the international governance or international dialogue on governance. I think, in all fairness, this needs to be on the table too. Okay. Well, I leave out the question of the ethics frameworks now. I think there is probably some convergence there, different traditions, and we would need to sit down to sort that out a little bit more to better understand each other. And I think if that is a result of the 5 principles that the US report introduced now, great. Yeah. For once we are actually addressing the ethical questions and do not sell them cheaply. I'm an ethicist, so I'm interested in that. Not to say ethics is just your gut feeling or your conviction that you have come up with. No, ethics is about the reflection of these gut feelings and intuitions and maybe convictions, commitments, and so on. And we should really deal with it on that level and not in another way. With respect to the biosecurity, yes, but the EGE actually has, I think, addressed this question with a few recommendations. So we say that we recommend that the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development of the Bioweapon Convention should incorporate provisions on the limitation or prohibition of research in synthetic biology. Okay, and second, the group asks the Commission to define, in consultation with the EGE, a comprehensive security and ethics framework for synthetic biology. It's not there. That's the presupposition of this recommendation. And the group recommends that the European Commission first ensure that databases are available to all who use them. Second, provides the legal systems for companies to report to competent authorities when asked to synthesize suspicious sequences whilst ensuring privacy. Third, identifies the chain, asks the European Commission to identify the chain of responsibility for placing particular sequences in the databases and identifying them as potentially harmful. So that is kind of proactive. what should be done. Okay, and I believe that nothing of this is in place, especially not the biosecurity and ethics framework. And again, coming back to the complex issues, if we do not deal with these questions, either in energy or in environment or in health or here in biosecurity, military and bioterrorism, both, yeah, what are we going to do here? And we then come back to these points later on: secure soldiers' rights and protect their health and safety, as well as civilians and all citizens. This is why I think the human rights approach that we take is so important. Even though it is compatible with the responsible stewardship, I think why not turn to the frameworks that are out there, the ethics frameworks?
You know, and I think
share,
some
you know.
in the United States would rather that we were able to talk about some of the concerns that you discuss under that framework, in particular solidarity. I think we would love to be able to have those kinds of concepts play a larger role in our own ethical discourse. So I applaud what you've done and invite more international dialogue to get these concepts across the Atlantic, some of them, yes.
Yeah. Mm.
So,
If I could just quickly, very pointedly respond to your biosecurity issue. Having been a delegate to the BWC in former life, I invest very low optimism in the possibility of codifying this by agreement in a multilateral setting like that. Worse, the question of enforceability and interpretation. So my question back to you would be, always assume that your ideal framework for fixing this doesn't ever come to be. How do you make this work in lieu of that ideal framework in an international setting where you really put a premium on biosecurity and you want these principles to be upheld?
Well, you know, our advantage is that we are the EGE. So we are not free floating or so, but we really have an institutional tooth to the European Union's policies. At least the EGE opinions need to be heard. At least they need to be addressed. They need to be considered. And our experience over the last few years is that more and more this is the case. And then all of a sudden, if you read, for example, the activity report of the EGE, there's a whole chapter on that, how the European Commission has taken up the recommendations of the EGE. All of a sudden, it is at least part of the European policy. And then it comes to the international arena. And of course, I mean, who would be all too optimistic about a simple translation process? I mean, but that would be just naive or romantic or idealistic or so. But does that mean that we should not make our points? No, of course not. We have to also find allies. For a reasonable approach, we have to discuss and debate, respectful when we disagree, and so on and so on. Yeah, but I think that is a slight advantage of the institutional setup of the EGE in comparison to the US, and this also explains why we must be more specific in our recommendations.
Absolutely. I mean, just along those lines, everyone probably knows this, but the commission is advisory to the president. Mm-hmm. The president then can decide whether to take up the recommendations, and then we were, in many of them, very specific in terms of saying, you know, maybe this agency or this group should look into this, but it's too soon to tell how many of those things will actually happen.
Any more? Let's see. Yeah, way in the back.
I'm Dana Perkins. I'm with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. I actually have two questions. I have time for them. Unlike Bob over there, I am a current member of the U.S. delegation to the Biological Weapons Convention. And I would also like to mention that the issue of synthetic biology was brought up at the BWC in the intersessional meetings that we had. So it's not a new issue that it will be brought up to Geneva this year. And this year is very important because it will be the 7th review conference of the Biological Weapons Convention, when agreements that the states parties will reach will become legally binding on all member states of BWC. However, I am very interested when you mentioned prohibitions on research on synthetic biology to be brought up as an amendment to BWC. And BWC has Article 1 general prohibitions against research, development, production, and use of biological weapons, regardless of the way or technologies that are used toward these prohibited activities. So I was wondering what was the background of coming with such a recommendation, since the BWC covers whatever biological weapons, whether it's genetically engineered or so it's such a large prohibition that I didn't think you'll have to be that specific with regard to synthetic biology, especially since it's a dual-use technology, if you want. It's not directed toward creation of a biological weapon. And the second question, with regard to, maybe it's too strong a word, toward the enforcement of your recommendations, I would like to know, you're talking about the impact assessment and things people should do before research is undertaken or funded. Are you talking only about research funded by EU, EC, or you're also covering research funded by private sources? And in that case, how are you going to do outreach to that group that is sort of in the US as well, sort of, in a niche outside the government reach, if I may say so? How are you going to reach for those private sources to educate them about your recommendations and what they can do to be responsible stewards? And I will just mention, I was just reading last night about Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation actually funding synthetic biology projects, global health, grand challenges in human health. The competition is still open if there are synthetic biologists among us. So they specifically ask for synthetic biology use for solving grand challenges in global health. Thank you.
This is a pretty fascinating question, because we know that an awful lot of this funding is actually private sector, it's foundation sector. So yeah, it would be interesting to get responses to how you kind of drive some of the recommendations into the private sector.
Yeah. First, very, very quickly on the biosecurity, we ask for provisions of research limitation, or incorporate provisions on the limitations or prohibition of research in synthetic biology. That is not the same as asking for the prohibition of research, of course. Yeah, as I mentioned before, the EU is already funding. That is public funding, okay? Research. I and the EGE did not call for a stop or moratorium or whatever of funding. That would be a misunderstanding. We are talking about provisions, how to do it reasonably. With respect to biosecurity, we clearly stated there's a conflict between, on the one hand side, transparency and security, but also freedom of research and security matters and so on. So this recommendation is really meant as a kind of an, let's say, eye-opener on the one hand side to really look at that with synthetic biology. This is more important than in other areas in new technologies that we are dealing with, and see how an amendment can be made. So, and we were of course aware that there are already discussions and debates, and we wanted to push these. Okay, so for that, the research in the public and private, well, that is certainly the most complicated issue that we have. On the one hand side, we want, let's say, to promote research when we see that it is and could be beneficent. So the malaria, artemisinin research clinical trial now is certainly one. Even though we would say, look closely whether this is the right way to fight malaria. I'm not saying that it is not. But I'm also not saying this is the one and only way where we can go, because there is already immune reaction against artemisinin, and maybe there must be a shared effort with all different kinds of strategies to fight malaria. But certainly that is one area in synthetic biology that is the most promising example that is always quoted, of course, but where we really want to take a close look and not to over-regulate in a way so that this research cannot take place anymore. But as Lino also said, in the medical sector, regulation is much, much, much better than in other areas. For example, as we said, in textiles or cosmetics, yeah, you almost have no regulations in with respect to things that would be unbelievable in the medical or health area. Okay, so that is one thing. How to reach out to the private sector. The only thing you can do is to, for example, have regulation in place as with respect, for example, the biosafety. Do you want to adapt, for example, in environmental or energy studies, a security level of labs so that this can be secured by law? Then in the European Union's context, the member states have to take that over. So the directive on biosafety needs to be applied to synthetic biology, and then it applies to the private sector too. Yeah, long-term risk assessment. This, in the end, also becomes a legislative or a legal question, because, I mean, you can do private research as long as you want, but if you do not accord to the, or what is it? If you are not in accordance with the safety standards, then you can't do that. Public funding of research is an altogether different thing, because there you promote a certain direction, or, as we said, basic research, and we want that.
So what about?
I wanted to clarify that, yes, when you have laws and regulations in place, that's the easy way to cover everybody. When you just promote voluntary guidelines that sometimes come from the government,
but this is why we were a little bit and just because there was so much talk about the convergence of the EGE report and the US report. I think when it comes to that matter, the difference between the two reports actually is there, because we want more governance that is not just voluntary or self-regulated, self-made or voluntary guidelines or so, because we do not trust that as much as a comprehensive, very good regulatory framework.
I think being of European background, I completely agree with you. Working for the US government, I cannot agree, because I know that the scientific community in the United States actually, resists such regulations, because, I tend to agree with them too, being a scientist at the bench for so long, because of the administrative burden that we place on them and on us too, because we have to enforce those regulations. So
but in that respect now it becomes important. What does democratic deliberation, or what we say participatory decision making and so on, public science society dialogue, what does it actually mean? When it comes to that, science and scientists are only one group of stakeholders. The public is also a stakeholder, and there it becomes so important how to interpret then the principles that the U.S. report has established.
And I think, as has already been said, one of the things that's remarkable in this field is the diversity of scientists as well. Not only types of discipline, but where they're located and how many people are able to do science in their garage, so to speak. So those are big challenges.
We're going to have to bring this to a close. So I'm just going to ask each person to kind of go down and maybe just talk for a second about sort of the moving forward, whether you think there's kind of enough ground. Are you optimistic about, sort of being able to continue some sort of transatlantic dialogue? And the reports provide, I think, an interesting starting point. We certainly found that there is a lot of convergence there. The devil's in the details in some areas. But certainly, as we move forward here at the Wilson Center on our synthetic biology project, we think it's an important piece to continue to have this dialogue. This is just kind of the first step. And so I'd be interested in getting everyone's opinion about kind of what the next step might be. And we can, maybe we'll start. You want to start with you and go down that way?
Well, I think in my presentation I already expressed that I'm relatively optimistic in the sense that I see that, especially in terms of governance and procedures, I see this convergence on both sides. What I take actually from this discussion, what I now realize a little bit is that we may have been forgetting a bit too much the role and responsibility as well of the scientists themselves. I mean, also in the reports, obviously we address more. You address more governments and what governments should do, what we as regulators and policymakers can do. But obviously, the scientists themselves, be them publicly funded or privately funded, obviously have a special role and responsibility, and also have special knowledge. I mean, they're the ones that can be, say, the advanced warners of new developments. So I don't know, referring to the question that you raised, whether the scientific community in the US feels that there's this new red tape coming, and therefore kind of avoids getting involved in the discussions. But I think that's obviously there may be an opportunity to try to get them activated in becoming an active player in this discussion.
I would say, as in nanotechnology, synthetic biology gives us the opportunity now to really, really continue a transatlantic dialogue, not only between the ethics committees, but also probably a little bit broader with some kind of public engagement. There are so many possibilities that we have with the internet. We could have a civil society conference through the internet or whatever. You can just be creative of that. But I think it is pivotal for all of us now to start it, because unlike in GMO or in embryos research, also there's not an ideological divide from the beginning. And I think this is an advantage, not only not between Europe and the US, but also within the US or within Europe. It is a little bit more open, so we really desperately need to take this situation to proceed. And I personally, I'm very, very impressed that it is possible all of a sudden now, with the approach that the US report or commission takes, that we engage into an ethical deliberation. What kind of frameworks do we need here? And if I may say one thing, the Science Society dialogue, the EGE has said so much and discussed so much about that, how this can be done, including journalists, including media. This is not to say if they are informed, then they promote something. No, it is really a decent dialogue about our own views, and these may change when we listen to each other. At least this is my experience, having been on the EGE. That sometimes my positions or my perspectives change, and this is exactly what we need in a science society dialogue too. I hope this can be continued, and hopefully with the help of centers like the Wilson Center.
I think in direct response to your question, David, I'm optimistic actually about the continued international dialogue about this issue, and actually was impressed by the amount of convergence there was between these two statements. And I also think it's critical for all of us to remember this is not the end of the conversation, you know, that we need to do more work, that there needs to be more dialogue, that there needs to be more attention to this issue as things evolve and as we learn more from each other. I think I also want to just say two things about, I think science in general, and maybe there are a lot of other things too, but is increasingly international. And it doesn't make sense for different jurisdictions in the world to talk about how science ought to go, both in terms of its progress and its, carefully thought through limitations, without talking to the rest of the world, because everybody's doing similar things, and some often together. And then two last thoughts. I think I agree with you, Dr. Palla. The scientists have a central role in this. And one of the things that we did try to talk about in our report was creating a culture of responsibility or responsible stewardship among scientists, recognizing that not all scientists think that way, and they've never been asked to think that way, and that's an educational thing and a sort of culture shift thing. That plus, as I've already said, continuing to engage the public in understanding science, I think will help us with this international dialogue.
And science to understand the public.
And scientists to understand the public, absolutely.
I think I personally, and I think probably everyone in the room has learned a lot today about differences and convergences. I think some of the differences can be explained just in terms of time. If you have 6 months to issue a report and not 4 years, well, then you're going to have different levels of specificity and granularity of recommendations, obviously. We learned about how differences in authority and role can affect what the EGE can do versus what the President's Commission can do. We learned that some of the apparent strong differences may actually be less strong, that they may be behind what seem like very, very different approaches, precautionary principles versus moving ahead. Is there a great deal more a common concern for precaution and for science, respect for science. And then finally, there really are, I think, some genuine differences in political and cultural orientation that have to be addressed and dealt with. But yet I think what the Wilson Center has done today and what it will continue to do and what I think the two ethical bodies will continue to do gives me hope that we can begin to make some real progress. Not only is science not bounded by nations, but neither is life itself. And so we have to be commonly concerned about the implications of our research and our product development.
Well, join me in thanking everybody that came to have this fantastic discussion. It will continue, I'll guarantee you that.